When I agreed to become an au pair for the Jacobs family, I wasn't expecting anything extraordinary. I just needed a change, something different from my small hometown life after graduating college. You know how it is. I figured it would be an easy gig, some extra money before I started looking for a real job. Plus, I'd always loved kids, and the Jacobs seemed like a normal, laid-back family when we spoke on Zoom. They lived in a quiet suburban town in upstate New York. I could easily commute to the city on weekends, explore, maybe even figure out what I wanted to do next. It seemed like the perfect setup. I got there in June. The house was exactly how I pictured it. A cozy old two-story with a wraparound porch, the kind of place where you'd imagine sitting with a cup of coffee on a Sunday morning. It was isolated enough to be peaceful, but not so far that you felt cut off from the world. The neighbors were far enough away that you couldn't see them through the trees, but you knew they were there. The family, too, seemed nice enough. Lisa Jacobs, the mom, worked as a lawyer, mostly from home. Her husband Dan was in finance and traveled a lot for work. They had 2 kids. Chloe, a quiet 7-year-old girl with big glasses, and Evan, a typical 5-year-old boy who was obsessed with dinosaurs. I figured it would be an easy job, just helping out with the kids while Lisa worked during the day. For the first week, everything was totally normal. We settled into a routine. Wake up, get the kids ready, drop them off at their day camp, and have a few hours of quiet before picking them up in the afternoon. Lisa mostly stayed in her office dealing with clients and calls, and I spent my free time reading or going for walks around the property. It was peaceful, exactly what I wanted. But around the middle of the second week, something shifted. At first, it was just little things I could easily explain away. The front door would be unlocked in the morning when I swore I'd locked it the night before, or I'd find the kitchen cabinets open when I got up for a midnight snack. I figured I was just tired or distracted. After all, I was adjusting to a new routine, a new place. Then, one night, I heard it. I just put the kids to bed. Lisa was still up in her office, and I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner. That's when I heard this sound, a soft thud, like something had fallen. At first, I thought it was one of the kids knocking something over in their room, so I went upstairs to check. But when I peeked into their rooms, both of them were fast asleep. I stood there in the hallway for a second, listening, and that's when I heard it again. This time, it was clearer. It wasn't a thud, it was a tap, like someone was lightly knocking on one of the walls. Now, old houses make noises, I know that. But there was something about this sound. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It didn't feel like the usual creaks and groans of an old house settling at night. It felt like someone, or something, was knocking, trying to get attention. I shook it off, telling myself it was nothing, just the house doing its thing. But the next night, it happened again. This time I was in bed. It was late, probably around 1 a.m., when I woke up to that same knocking sound. It was faint at first, almost like it was coming from inside the walls. I sat up listening, and sure enough, there it was again. Tap, 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 right behind my headboard. I got up and opened the door to the hallway, and as soon as I did, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was thick, like the air had changed. I stood there for a minute, waiting for something, but there was nothing. Just silence. The next morning, I asked Lisa if she'd ever heard anything strange at night. She just shrugged and said, "Old houses make weird noises." But there was something in her tone, something that made me feel like she wasn't telling me everything. By the end of that week, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The knocking became more frequent, and it wasn't just at night. Sometimes I'd hear it during the day, faint taps that would echo through the house when I was alone. It was driving me crazy. But the worst part, the kids seemed to know. One afternoon, I was sitting with Chloe while she played with her dolls. Out of nowhere, she looked up at me and said, "Mommy doesn't like when she comes out." I froze. "Who?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The lady in the walls," she said, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "She comes out sometimes, but only when Mommy's not paying attention." I didn't know what to say. Chloe went back to playing, completely unfazed, but I felt a chill crawl up my spine. That night, after I put the kids to bed, I stayed up late. I couldn't sleep. I was lying there, staring at the ceiling, waiting. And then, right on cue, the knocking started again. But this time, It wasn't just knocking, it was footsteps. I heard them, slow and deliberate, walking down the hallway outside my door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I reached for my phone, turned on the flashlight, and pointed it at the door. The footsteps stopped. I sat there, frozen, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. But the door didn't open. No one came in. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, just listening to the silence. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I was done. I packed my bags and told Lisa I was leaving. I didn't give her a reason. I didn't need to. She didn't ask any questions. She just nodded, almost like she understood why I couldn't stay any longer. As I was leaving, Chloe came up to me. She didn't say anything, just stood there holding her doll. But as I bent down to say goodbye, she whispered, "She's going to miss you." I got in my car and drove away as fast as I could. I never looked back. I never thought I'd be telling a story like this. You know, I never believed in things that couldn't be explained. I mean, I grew up in a normal small town in Ohio, lived with my parents, went to a public school, did well in my classes. Nothing out of the ordinary. So when I signed up to be an au pair, I thought it was just a fun way to travel, meet new people, and make some money. But it turns out, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. It started with a Craigslist ad. I know, Craigslist isn't exactly the most trustworthy place to find a job. But everything about the posting looked legit. It was a family out in Massachusetts, about 40 minutes from Boston, in a quiet suburb called Ashford. The parents, Ben and Jessica Lowry, seemed pretty normal. We had a couple of Zoom calls where they introduced me to their two kids, Emily and Jake, ages 8 and 6. I felt good about it. The pay was great. They were offering me a small guest room in their house, and they were really friendly during the calls. Honestly, everything seemed perfect. When I arrived, though, I could tell something was off right away. The house itself was, well, let's just say it had character. It was a big, old, colonial-style house with creaky floorboards, high ceilings, and drafty windows. But okay, old houses make noise, right? So I didn't think much of it. Jessica and Ben welcomed me warmly, although they seemed a bit distant, almost like they were distracted. But hey, parents are busy, right? The kids, Emily and Jake, were shy at first, but that's pretty typical when you meet new people. My first few days went smoothly. I'd help get the kids ready for school in the morning, then pick them up in the afternoon, and we'd spend the evening doing homework, eating dinner, and maybe watching some TV before bed. Jessica worked from home, but she kept to her office most of the day, and Ben was always out. He was in real estate, so his schedule was unpredictable. Still, everything seemed fine, at first. Then, about a week in, things started to get strange. It began with small stuff, like hearing footsteps in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was the kids wandering around, but when I checked on them, they were always fast asleep. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, though. Old houses settle, right? And I didn't want to seem like the paranoid new au pair. But then there was Emily. She was different. She wasn't like any kid I'd met before. She was smart, really smart for her age. But she had this way of watching you, like she was sizing you up. She barely spoke unless you asked her a direct question. One day, while we were coloring together, she just blurted out, "The house doesn't like you." I froze. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to laugh it off, but there was something in her eyes, like she wasn't joking. "The house," she said again, her voice completely serious. "It doesn't like when people stay here too long. You should go home." I didn't know how to respond. I mean, kids say weird things all the time, right? So, I laughed it off and changed the subject. But after that, I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of someone pacing outside my door. It wasn't loud, just this slow, steady walking back and forth. I sat up in bed listening, my heart pounding in my chest. I was sure it was one of the kids, so I got out of bed and quietly opened the door. But the hallway was empty. I stood there listening. Nothing. Not a single sound. I must have stood in that doorway for a good minute before I finally convinced myself it was my imagination. The next morning, I asked Jessica if one of the kids had been up during the night. She just gave me this odd look and shook her head. "They sleep like rocks," she said. almost like she thought I was imagining things. And maybe I was, but something still didn't feel right. A few days later, I started noticing things moving around in the house. I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter, and a few hours later, I'd find them in the living room. I know it sounds stupid, like I was just being forgetful, but it wasn't just me. Jessica mentioned she couldn't find her phone one morning, only to find it later in the laundry room, somewhere she hadn't even been that day. I tried to laugh it off, but it was starting to get under my skin. Then one night, things got worse. It was around midnight, and I had just settled into bed when I heard Emily giggling from her room. Normally, I wouldn't think anything of it. Kids laugh in their sleep sometimes, right? But there was something about the way she was laughing. It wasn't the kind of laugh you hear when a kid is dreaming. It was wrong, like someone was with her, making her laugh. I got up, and as I approached her door, I could hear her talking in a low voice. I stopped outside her room, listening. "Who are you talking to, Emily?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I was expecting her to say she was just dreaming, but when I opened the door, she was sitting up in bed, wide awake, staring at me. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, without blinking, she whispered, "She doesn't like you." I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Who doesn't like me?" I asked, but she just stared at me with those same cold, unblinking eyes. I backed out of the room and closed the door, my hands shaking. Something was wrong. Something was seriously wrong with this house, and I had to get out. But the thing is, I couldn't just leave. I needed the money. I had quit my job back home to come out here, and I didn't have anywhere else to go. So I stayed. The next morning, everything was back to normal. Emily was her usual quiet self, Jake was his typical bouncy, energetic self, and Jessica and Ben acted like nothing strange had happened. But I knew something was off. Then came the night that pushed me over the edge. I was in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard the pacing again. This slow, deliberate walking back and forth in the hallway outside my door. This time, though, it wasn't just footsteps. I could hear whispering, low, hushed voices, too faint to make out what they were saying. I sat up, my heart pounding, and reached for my phone. I turned on the flashlight and opened the door, shining the light into the hallway. There was nothing there, but as I stepped into the hallway, I felt it, this cold, bone-chilling breeze, like the air had been sucked out of the house. I turned around and saw Emily standing at the end of the hallway, just watching me. Her face was blank, her eyes wide, and she whispered, "You should leave." That was it. I couldn't do it anymore. I packed my bags that night and left. I didn't even say goodbye to Jessica or Ben. I just got in my car and drove until I was far enough away from that house that I could breathe again. I never went back, and I never looked into what was going on in that house. But I can tell you this, whatever was there, whatever made Emily say those things, it wasn't normal. And I'll never, ever forget it.